Ethan's story begins with a simple, yet meaningful decision. After years of city stress and toxic environments in his previous apartment complex, he decided to make a major change. A lakeside cabin in a peaceful community, clear water shores, was the fresh start he'd been dreaming of. The pristine lake, surrounded by magnificent old oak trees, was the perfect place to escape from the chaos. The tranquility of the area made him feel right at home. He thought he had found his perfect spot in life, a place where he could fish every morning, enjoy the peaceful surroundings, and start anew. Before moving in, Ethan had done his homework. He checked all community rules and HOA regulations to make sure there were no restrictions on lake usage or fishing. Everything indicated that the lake was a shared resource, accessible to all residents. This was exactly what he was looking for after his experiences in more restrictive, chaotic living situations. However, what Ethan didn't know was that the area he had chosen, right under the largest oak tree on the eastern shore, had been claimed by someone else. Karen, the HOA president, had been using this spot as her personal meditation and photo backdrop for years. She wasn't about to let some newcomer take over her territory without a fight. Ethan would learn this the hard way on his third morning fishing. That morning, while peacefully fishing by the lake, Karen stormed over to his spot, clipboard in hand, like a self-proclaimed enforcer of community rules. "Excuse me," she said, her voice laced with barely contained irritation. "Do you know this is a private community area?" Ethan, taken aback by her aggressive tone, looked around, confused. "I thought this was a public lake available to all residents," he replied, genuinely puzzled. "I pay HOA fees just like everyone else here." Karen's irritation seemed to grow with every word, and she continued, "There are community guidelines about lake usage and maintaining the aesthetic integrity of our shared spaces." She waved her clipboard like it was an official decree, further adding to the tension. "Okay, I definitely want to follow all the rules," Ethan said, trying to stay calm. "Can you show me the specific rule I'm breaking?" At this, Karen was caught off guard. She stammered, I'll have to look that up for you." This, of course, only seemed to irritate her more, as she added, "But this disrupts the peaceful environment we've worked so hard to maintain here." Ethan, sensing the real issue, smiled slightly. "Mom, fishing is a peaceful activity. I'm literally sitting here quietly, not bothering anyone," he replied, trying to de-escalate the situation. But Karen was already too far gone to listen. Her face flushed with frustration, and her voice rose an octave as she lost her composure. "This is my spot. I've been coming here every single morning for years. This is where I do my meditation and photography." Now, Ethan finally understood the true issue. It wasn't about rules, or the lake's usage, or even the aesthetics of the community. It was about territory. Karen had claimed this spot as her own, and she wasn't used to being questioned. "Your spot?" Ethan asked calmly, keeping his voice level. "Who exactly decided that this public lakefront belonged to you personally?" For a moment, Karen was speechless. Her face turned red, and she seemed to struggle mentally for a reasonable answer. When she couldn't find one, she did what most people like her do when they're caught. She got louder and more aggressive. "I don't appreciate your tone, young man," Karen snapped. "I'm the president of this OA, and I will not be spoken to this way by someone who clearly doesn't understand how things work around here." Ethan, having dealt with similar HOA bullies before, recognized exactly what he was facing. A person who thought their title gave them the right to control everything. But instead of backing down, he decided to stand his ground. "I understand you're the HOA president," Ethan said, keeping his voice respectful despite her increasing hostility. "I have complete respect for that position and the work you do. That's why I'm asking you to show me the specific rules I'm supposedly breaking. I want to be a good neighbor and follow all the community guidelines properly." Karen, flustered and desperate, muttered something about checking the official documents before storming off toward her house. Ethan watched as her angry footsteps echoed across the dock, feeling a strange sense of victory. He had managed to defuse the situation, but he knew this was only the beginning. The next day, Ethan's fishing spot was exactly the same as it had been on the previous morning. Peaceful, quiet, and undisturbed by the tension of yesterday. But he knew Karen wouldn't let it go that easily. She had already made it clear that she wasn't going to give up on her claim over the lakefront. In fact, he had a strong feeling that Karen's next move was going to be even more dramatic than the last. Sure enough, by the following morning, Ethan noticed Karen watching him from her kitchen window. The cold, calculating expression on her face confirmed that she was planning something. As he sat there, patiently casting his line into the lake, he could practically hear her wheels turning. She was going to take this to another level. The thought of having to face off with someone like Karen made him feel frustrated, but he was determined to stand his ground. This wasn't just about fishing. This was about reclaiming his peace and not letting anyone bully him off public property. That afternoon, Ethan decided to try something a little different. If Karen wanted to play games and test his limits, he would start playing right back. He had been careful to follow all of the community guidelines, but this time he decided to push the boundaries of her tolerance. Instead of sitting quietly with his usual umbrella, Ethan brought out a bright red beach umbrella, the kind that screamed for attention. It was loud, bright, and utterly impossible to ignore. It wasn't against any rules, but it was definitely not the sort of thing that blended in with the surrounding natural beauty of the lakefront. He could already picture Karen's reaction, and he had to admit, he was looking forward to it. As he set up the umbrella and got comfortable for his usual fishing session, he couldn't help but chuckle to himself. Karen would certainly be in for a surprise. He didn't know exactly what she would do, but he was betting it would be over the top. As he cast his line into the lake, he made sure to look up and see if she was watching. Sure enough, Karen was in her window again, staring at him with an intensity that felt almost like daggers. The next morning, Ethan stepped it up even further. This time, he brought out a small portable speaker and set it up beside him. He wasn't planning on blasting music, but instead, he created what he dubbed his classical fishing playlist. It was a mix of smooth jazz and soft instrumental music, the kind of relaxing background noise that was pleasant, but definitely audible from a distance. Ethan had noticed that Karen always did her morning yoga routine around the same time, and he couldn't resist the temptation to disrupt her perfect, serene mornings just a little bit. He kept the volume at a level that was perfectly legal and within the community guidelines, but still impossible for her to ignore. From his spot by the lake, Ethan could see her through the window, her yoga routine now interrupted by the calming sounds of jazz drifting over to her property. He smiled, knowing that Karen would be getting more frustrated with each passing moment. This was starting to feel like a game of chess, and he was determined to outsmart her every step of the way. On the fourth day, Ethan's patience was starting to pay off. He noticed that Karen was once again spying on him from her window, but this time, he wasn't just fishing peacefully. No, this time he had a new plan. Ethan waved enthusiastically in her direction, calling out with over-the-top cheerfulness, "Good morning, Mrs. Sinclair. Beautiful day for lake activities, isn't it?" He made sure his voice was as friendly and chipper as possible, knowing full well that it would drive Karen crazy. As he expected, her face turned a deep shade of red. The intense scowl that she gave him could have burned a hole through the air, but Ethan only smiled back, clearly enjoying the moment. His plan was working. With each wave and each cheerful greeting, he could see her growing more and more irritated. But what was truly satisfying was knowing that she couldn't do anything about it. She had already shown her true colors, and now everyone in the community would be able to see just how over the top she could be. By day 5, Ethan was fully committed to his plan. He set up a full-fledged fishing station, complete with a folding table, a comfortable camping chair, a thermos of coffee, and snacks. This wasn't just a quick fishing session anymore. This was a statement. He was planning to spend his mornings here, in his spot by the lake, for as long as he wanted. Ethan could tell that Karen was watching, and her escalating frustration was now more evident than ever. She had started sending passive-aggressive emails about noise violations and community standards. But Ethan remained calm, continuing with his fishing as if nothing was out of the ordinary. At this point, Karen's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. She was trying everything she could to force him out of her spot. But Ethan wasn't backing down. Her behavior had gone from passive-aggressive to downright desperate. She started coughing dramatically as she walked by, pretending the air was somehow polluted by his fishing activities. She even started spraying air freshener in his direction, muttering loudly about fishy odors, despite the fact that Ethan always practiced catch and release fishing. Every time she tried to escalate the situation, Ethan simply smiled and documented it all. He had every interaction on camera, carefully recording each attempt she made to interfere with his peaceful fishing routine. As the days went on, Karen's frustration mounted, and Ethan's resolve strengthened. The more she tried to control him, the more determined he became to stand his ground and protect his right to enjoy the lake. It was clear to Ethan now Karen wasn't just trying to bully him off the lake. She was using her position as HOA president to bully anyone she saw as a threat to her control. And Ethan wasn't going to let that happen. The battle between Ethan and Karen reached a boiling point after 5 intense days of escalating drama. Karen's frustration had become palpable, her every move more desperate, as she tried to regain control of what she thought was her personal territory by the lake. Ethan, however, wasn't going anywhere. His resolve had strengthened, and he was determined to outsmart her. On the 6th day, the tension finally snapped. Ethan was settling in for what he expected to be another peaceful morning of fishing, when he noticed Karen marching across the lawn towards him. This wasn't the casual stroll she had made before. No, this time she was carrying a thick folder of papers, looking like she was heading to court. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He had expected some kind of confrontation. But not like this. Karen approached him with a dramatic flair, waving the papers in front of him like they were the holy grail of legal documents. "I have the official community guidelines here," she announced, her voice booming with exaggerated authority. "You've been violating them every day with your noise, your fishing gear, and your complete disregard for the aesthetic integrity of this community." Ethan raised an eyebrow and leaned back in his chair, still holding his fishing rod. He wasn't going to give in to her theatrics. "Okay, Karen, let's take a look at those documents," he said coolly. Karen's eyes narrowed, her face flushed with indignation. "You'll see," she hissed. "You'll see just how wrong you are." Ethan took the papers from her, noticing immediately that they didn't look as official as she was making them out to be. There were no community logos or signatures, just generic templates she'd clearly printed from the internet. The words, "Insert community name here," were still visible in several places. "Karen, these aren't even our official bylaws," Ethan said, unable to hide a slight chuckle. "These are just random HOA templates you found online." Karen's face turned beet red, her frustration building as she desperately flipped through the papers, trying to salvage her already shaky argument. You don't understand," she stammered. "This is serious. You're disrupting everything." Ethan remained calm, and a small, triumphant smile crept across his face. "Karen, I've been documenting everything. Every conversation, every interaction, every false claim you've made, and I have video footage to prove it." At those words, Karen's expression froze. She hadn't expected him to have evidence of all the times she had tried to intimidate him and manipulate the situation in her favor. The power dynamic had shifted. Ethan was no longer the person on the defensive, he was in control now. Karen's next move was equally predictable. She tried to escalate the situation by calling in the HOA representative, Sarah Jenkins, in an attempt to have Ethan removed from the lake area altogether. She sent an email, carefully crafting her own version of events, accusing Ethan of violating every rule in the book. But what Karen didn't know was that Ethan had already prepared for this. 2 days later, Sarah called Ethan. This time, the conversation was different. The usual formal tone in Sarah's voice had been replaced with something more genuine. "Mr. Johnson, we've received a series of complaints about your fishing activities. I wanted to get your side of the story before we move forward." Ethan could tell from her voice that she wasn't entirely buying Karen's version of events. He decided this was the perfect opportunity to present the evidence he had collected over the past week. "I've been recording everything, Sarah," Ethan said calmly, as he pulled up his phone and started showing her the footage. "Every single interaction, every aggressive move Karen has made, every false claim she's filed. I have it all." There was a long silence on the other end of the line before Sarah spoke again. You have it all on video?" she asked, sounding both surprised and impressed. "Yep," Ethan replied. "Everything. And I'd be happy to share it with you for a full review of the situation. I think the truth will speak for itself." Ethan could feel the shift in Sarah's attitude as she processed what he was saying. "We need to take a closer look at this," Sarah said finally, her voice filled with a new sense of respect. "Would you be willing to share this evidence with the HOA board at our next meeting?" Ethan agreed, his confidence growing. Karen had no idea what was coming. She had spent days spinning lies and trying to bully him, but now, the truth was on his side, and he was about to turn the tables completely. The next OA meeting was set for just a few days later. Ethan meticulously organized his video footage, making sure it was all in chronological order, ready to present the full story. He knew that this was his moment to expose Karen for what she truly was. A power-hungry bully who had manipulated her position for far too long. When the meeting finally arrived, the tension in the room was palpable. Karen was sitting at the front with her usual air of superiority, while Ethan calmly set up his laptop to show the evidence. The residents who had gathered were curious, knowing that something big was about to go down. As the meeting began, Sarah called on Karen to present her case first. Karen wasted no time, launching into a dramatic speech about how Ethan had been terrorizing her for days, making false accusations about her character, and disrupting the peace of the entire community. But Ethan wasn't worried. He knew the truth was on his side. When it was his turn, he simply pressed play on his laptop. The room fell silent as the first video began to play. It was a recording of Karen's initial confrontation with Ethan, where she tried to claim ownership of the lakefront property and accuse him of breaking non-existent rules. As the footage continued, Ethan's calm demeanor and Karen's increasingly erratic behavior became apparent. The more Ethan showed, the more the mood in the room shifted. Residents were shocked to see the extent of Karen's manipulations. The final blow came when Ethan played the video of Karen trying to grab his fishing rod and then falsely accusing him of pushing her. The gasps in the room were audible. But it wasn't just the video that struck a chord with the community. It was the fact that Karen had been caught red-handed. And everyone could see that she had been abusing her position of power for years. The board members looked at each other in disbelief, finally understanding the extent of Karen's manipulations. Then, Sarah dropped the bombshell. "We've had multiple complaints about Mrs. Sinclair over the years," she said, her voice steady. "And now, thanks to Mr. Johnson's documentation, we have undeniable proof of her behavior." One by one, residents stood up to share their stories, each one more shocking than the last. A mother spoke of how Karen had forced her son to remove his basketball hoop, despite it being within the community's guidelines. An elderly couple talked about how Karen had reported them for drying their laundry outside. More and more people revealed how Karen had used her position to push them around, and finally, the truth was out in the open. Karen's reign of terror had come to an end. After that meeting, the atmosphere in the Clearwater Shores community completely shifted. The residents' stories about Karen's abusive power made everyone realize that they had been living under an invisible shadow for years. Karen, once someone who had felt untouchable, was now exposed. The stories shared by the community members were not just personal grievances but a series of tyrannical actions Karen had maintained for years. However, despite being exposed, Karen wasn't ready to give up. After the meeting ended, Karen stood up, not looking defeated at all. Her face was red with anger, her eyes glaring at the room. Her hands were shaking, tightly clutching her phone, as though she was preparing for her next move, her next plan. It was clear. Karen wasn't ready to accept her downfall yet. The next move, as Ethan had predicted, wouldn't be a simple act of surrender. It would be a retaliatory strike. After the meeting ended, Ethan heard from other residents that Karen had started approaching them in an underhanded way, subtly pressuring them. She targeted those with good relations with Ethan, trying to manipulate them against him. Ethan wasn't worried, though. He knew Karen's behavior would escalate. The next morning, Ethan decided to test his theory about Karen's true motivations and triggers. If she was going to complain about aesthetics and community standards, he figured it was time to give her something truly worth complaining about. Instead of his usual camouflage umbrella that blended with the surroundings, Ethan brought out a bright red beach umbrella, the kind that could probably be seen from space. He set it up in his usual spot, knowing Karen's reaction would be priceless. Day 2 of his plan included some strategic audio. Ethan brought out a small portable speaker, playing classical music, a mix of smooth jazz and instrumental tracks. He timed it perfectly for when he saw Karen doing her morning yoga. The music was just loud enough to be impossible to ignore, but not loud enough to violate any noise ordinances. He knew this would disrupt her peaceful routine, and he enjoyed every second of it. Day 3 saw Ethan getting more creative with his fishing line placements. He strategically placed the lines in the walking path that Karen usually used, with bright orange bobbers that would catch the light. It was a subtle move, but it forced Karen to either walk under or around them. Her frustration was becoming evident, and it was exactly what Ethan had been hoping for. On day 4, Ethan greeted Karen in the most cheerful manner possible whenever he saw her glaring from her kitchen window. "Good morning, Mrs. Sinclair. Beautiful day for lake activities, isn't it?" He'd call out with forced cheerfulness. The more Ethan waved and greeted her, the more agitated Karen became. Every time he saw her face, it was filled with growing frustration. Ethan even started recording her reactions, capturing her obvious fury. Day 5 was when Ethan decided to take it up a notch. He set up a small folding table, complete with tackle boxes, a thermos of coffee, snacks, and a comfortable camping chair. His message was clear: he wasn't just a temporary visitor, he was staking a permanent claim in the community. By this time, Karen's responses had gone from annoyance to outright rage. She began sending Ethan passive, aggressive emails about noise violations and community standards, despite the fact that his activities were quieter than most. By day 6, Karen was no longer just annoyed. She had become completely unhinged. She marched over to Ethan's fishing spot, clutching a thick folder of documents she claimed were official HOA regulations. The documents, however, turned out to be completely fabricated. When Ethan politely asked to see the real community rules, Karen was caught off guard, clearly unable to defend her position. Just 2 days later, Ethan received an official phone call from Sarah Jenkins, the community's HOA representative. The tone of Sarah's voice was noticeably different this time. "Mr. Johnson," Sarah said, her voice serious, "We've received some very serious complaints about your lake activities. We need to discuss this as soon as possible." The complaint Karen had filed was exaggerated and full of lies. According to Sarah's summary, Ethan was accused of disturbing wildlife, creating noise pollution, monopolizing community resources, and negatively impacting property values. But Sarah, after hearing Ethan's side, was starting to see the truth. Ethan calmly explained that he had been documenting everything and that he had video footage of all the incidents. The silence on the other end of the phone was palpable as Sarah processed the information. Finally, Sarah asked if Ethan would be willing to present his documentation to the HOA board. Ethan agreed. He had all the evidence, and now he was ready to show the entire community what had really been going on. 2 days later, Karen's behavior escalated in a way Ethan hadn't anticipated. When she arrived at the HOA meeting, her face was flushed with rage, and she wasted no time in accusing Ethan of stalking her with a weapon, his fishing rod. The officers had arrived in full force, prepared to handle what they were told was a serious situation. But instead, they quickly realized that the only weapon in sight was a fishing rod, and the real problem was Karen's lies. The officers, after reviewing the footage Ethan had provided, were not only unimpressed with Karen's accusations, but also recognized her history of false claims. They warned Karen about misusing police resources and advised her to stop filing false reports. But Ethan knew that Karen wasn't finished yet. She had already caused enough disruption, and he was ready for whatever would come next. The HOA board quickly took action. With the evidence Ethan provided, the community saw the full extent of Karen's manipulation and her abuse of power. They voted to remove her from her position, and new guidelines were put in place to ensure no one would ever again use their power to intimidate others. But as Ethan watched Karen retreat from the community meeting, he couldn't help but wonder, was this truly the end? Karen had been backed into a corner, but desperate people do desperate things. Ethan was prepared for what would come next. The weeks following Karen's removal from her position as HOA president were, surprisingly, peaceful. The tension that had once dominated the neighborhood slowly started to dissipate. The community members, who had lived in fear of Karen's wrath for so long, were finally able to breathe freely. Neighbors who had been too intimidated to speak up about their grievances began sharing their stories, and the collective weight of years of harassment was lifted from their shoulders. The community that had once felt like a group of isolated individuals now started to resemble a true neighborhood. But even though Karen's power had been stripped away, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was far from over. He'd seen enough to know that people like Karen don't just accept defeat. They fight back in ways you'd never expect. It was during this time that Sarah Jenkins, the HOA representative who had supported Ethan from the start, called him with some concerning news. "Ethan, I need to meet with you," she said, her tone uncharacteristically serious. "Karen is planning something. I don't know exactly what, but I've seen a few things that have me worried. I think she's not done." Ethan's gut sank. Despite everything that had happened, despite the public humiliation and the official warning from the police, he knew Karen wouldn't go down quietly. After all, she'd built her life around controlling others. Losing that control, he knew it was something she would never accept. "I'll meet you at the community center in an hour," Ethan replied, already feeling the weight of the situation bearing down on him once more. When they met, Sarah wasted no time getting to the point. "I've been watching her, Ethan. She's been going around to residents, speaking privately, trying to rally support. She's not trying to get her job back as HOA president, she's aiming for something else. Something more dangerous. I don't know what her next move is, but I can feel it. It's like she's planning a power grab, and I think it's going to be big." The tension in the air was palpable. Ethan sat in silence for a moment, processing Sarah's words. Karen was dangerous, no doubt. But the thought of her trying to regroup and come back stronger terrified him. He had to act fast. "I'll do whatever it takes to stop her, Sarah," Ethan said, his voice steady. "I've already documented everything once. If she's making moves, we need to get ahead of it. We need to be prepared." Over the next few days, Ethan began gathering more evidence, interviewing neighbors who had been approached by Karen, and making sure that every conversation and every claim she made was being recorded. The community had seen Karen's true colors now, but it didn't mean she couldn't find new ways to manipulate people. Ethan had to be ready. By the end of the week, he had compiled a massive file, full of statements from residents, recordings of Karen's attempts to stir up trouble, and new video evidence that showed just how far Karen was willing to go. It was clear to Ethan that she was trying to reassert control, not just of the HOA, but of the entire community. But then, something unexpected happened. Ethan was in his backyard one afternoon when he saw Karen walking toward him. Her posture was stiff, but there was something different in her eyes. Something calculated. He could feel the shift in the air. This was no longer about petty complaints or personal grievances. This was something bigger. Something more dangerous. "I know what you've been doing, Ethan," Karen said, her voice cold. "You think you've won. But you don't know who you're dealing with. I don't care about the HOA anymore. I'm coming for you, and I'll make sure everyone in this neighborhood knows who you really are." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He knew Karen wasn't bluffing. He'd seen her destroy lives before. This was more than just a fight for control. This was a battle for survival. And he had to win. With the evidence in hand, Ethan knew it was time to go public with everything he had gathered. The community needed to know the truth. They had to see Karen for who she truly was, a manipulative, power-hungry individual who had used her position to intimidate and exploit those around her. Ethan decided to call an emergency community meeting, one that would lay everything out in the open. The residents needed to see the truth for themselves. And once they did, they would have no choice but to stand with him. The night of the meeting, Ethan stood before the group, the weight of everything he had endured heavy on his shoulders. But as he looked out at the faces of the neighbors, the people who had once feared Karen, he saw something different. They were ready for change. They were ready to fight back. And so, with a deep breath, Ethan began his presentation. Slide by slide, he showed the evidence, the video recordings, the testimonies from the residents, and the proof of Karen's manipulation and lies. The room was silent as the truth unfolded before them. There was no more denying it. Karen had been using her power to control the community, and it was time for that to end. When he finished, the room erupted in applause. The residents, once intimidated, now felt empowered. They knew what had to be done. Karen's days of bullying were over. But as Ethan looked out at the crowd, a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from the end. The real battle was just beginning. In the days following the tense encounter with Karen, Ethan couldn't shake off the feeling that she was planning something bigger. Although she had been exposed in front of the community and lost her HOA president position, he knew that Karen wasn't finished yet. She wasn't just a defeated bully. She was someone desperate to regain the power she had lost. That evening, after spending the day gathering more evidence and analyzing the situation, Ethan decided that it was time to act. He called Sarah, suggesting a private meeting. Only she and a few trusted neighbors could help him handle the escalating threats from Karen. Sarah, always understanding the situation, agreed right away. She knew there was no time to waste. She arrived that evening, and they immediately began discussing what steps they needed to take next. "Ethan, I think Karen is trying to regain control, but not through the HOA directly. She's likely planning to form alliances with people who are dissatisfied with the board's decision," Sarah said, her voice heavy with concern. "We can't let her keep using her position to bully people." Ethan nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. He knew Sarah was the only one who could help him form a concrete plan of action. She wasn't just a neutral observer. She was one of the few who had been exposed to Karen's manipulative tactics firsthand. "Karen will try to make a comeback. I'm sure of it," Ethan said, his voice calm but determined. "But this time, we're gonna outsmart her." Sarah nodded in agreement. "We need to move quickly. She's already shown her hand, but we need to be strategic. Let's expose her for what she really is." The next day, they began putting their plan into motion. Sarah reached out to other residents who had been affected by Karen's actions and invited them to meet. They would form a united front to ensure Karen's scheming wouldn't succeed. Ethan started gathering video footage and documentation of Karen's harassment and intimidation. Every interaction, every overstep she had made, was recorded. He knew this evidence would be crucial. The game was about to change. What Karen thought was a victory was only the beginning of her downfall. The following days were tense. As the community gathered and the plan unfolded, Ethan and Sarah stayed vigilant, monitoring Karen's every move. She had vanished for a few days after losing her position as HOA president, but Ethan knew she was not the type to accept defeat quietly. It was only a matter of time before she made her next move. One evening, just as the sun was dipping behind the trees and the lake's water shimmered with a golden glow, Ethan received an unexpected phone call. It was Sarah, her voice laced with urgency. "Ethan, you need to get down here. Now. Karen's back, and she's with someone you won't believe," Sarah said, her tone sharp with concern. Ethan's heart raced. He quickly grabbed his jacket, grabbed his phone, and sped toward the community center. The earlier peace he had started to feel after Karen's fall from power quickly evaporated. He had been preparing for Karen to retaliate, but now, something told him this wasn't just another attempt to stir trouble. When he arrived, Sarah was standing near the entrance, her expression tight with worry. "I thought she would lay low, but she's not done yet." She's brought in outside help, Sarah explained. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Ooh. Sarah didn't answer immediately but pointed toward the group gathered around. Standing beside Karen in the center of the group was a tall man in a dark suit. His posture screamed authority, and Ethan could see the way the other residents were looking at him. Some in awe, others in nervous confusion. Who is that? Ethan asked, his voice low. That's lawyer Mark Darnell, Sarah replied, her voice low as well. Karen's hired him. He's known for representing aggressive HOA cases, particularly ones where property disputes escalate. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. This was no longer a simple neighborhood dispute. Karen had brought in an expert, someone who could potentially turn the tables and make their fight even harder. But Ethan had no intention of backing down now. Karen, noticing him, smiled slyly. There he is, Mr. Johnson the troublemaker. Come on, join us, she called out, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. We were just discussing what to do with all these false claims you've been making. Ethan squared his shoulders, walking toward the group. He wasn't going to let Karen have the last word. Not now. Not after everything they'd fought for. Karen, Mark, Ethan said, his voice steady. I assume you've brought in your legal team because you've run out of tricks. The truth has already been laid out. I've done my homework. You may have the law on your side, but I have the truth. Karen's eyes flashed with anger. She motioned to Mark, who stepped forward, his gaze cold and calculating. Mr. Johnson, while you may feel you've won some small victory, Mark said, his voice smooth and persuasive, we've been reviewing the HOA bylaws, and we've found multiple ways to challenge your actions. You've broken several rules in your pursuit of this vendetta. You're fishing. Your very presence near the lake is a violation of community rules. If you don't step aside, we'll have no choice but to take legal action. Ethan didn't flinch. He had expected this, and he was ready. Mark, you may want to reconsider your client's position. Because all of these claims you're throwing at me, they don't hold water. You're trying to enforce rules that don't exist. The crowd was silent, hanging on his every word. Karen, now visibly rattled, shot a glance at Mark, who seemed to consider his next move carefully. This isn't over, Mr. Johnson, Karen hissed, her voice tight with fury. You've made a mistake challenging me, and believe me, we have the resources to make this much more difficult for you. Ethan stood his ground, his mind sharp and clear. You're right about one thing, Karen. This isn't over. But if you want to escalate this war, I'm ready. As Ethan looked around the group of neighbors who had gathered, he realized something important. The tide was turning. The same residents who had once been afraid to speak out were now paying attention, their eyes wide with realization. They were starting to see the truth of Karen's manipulative behavior, and they were beginning to rally behind him. Let's see who's really in control here, Ethan muttered under his breath. He knew this fight was far from over, but now, more than ever, he was certain that Karen's reign of intimidation was coming to an end. And he was going to make sure of it. The tension in the air was palpable. The confrontations, the glaring eyes between Ethan and Karen, and especially the appearance of Mark, the lawyer Karen had brought in, made everything feel even more serious. The community around them watched as a battle ensued, not just over rights, but over justice. After the intense meeting at the community center, Ethan knew he could no longer let Karen and her team of lawyers get away with what they were doing. Not only did he have the truth on his side, but he also had the support of many neighbors, people who were fed up with Karen's oppressive control over the community. But Ethan also knew that Karen wouldn't back down easily, and things would only get uglier. One early morning, when the sun had just begun to rise and bathe the old oak trees by the lake in golden light, Ethan received an unexpected phone call from Sarah. Her voice was anxious. Ethan, Karen isn't backing down. She sent a letter demanding that all the improvements you've made to the community be undone. She's even threatening to sue. Ethan wasn't surprised. He had been preparing for this. He'd dealt with people like Karen before, and he knew exactly how this would play out. I'll go see her, he said calmly. The whole community needs to know the truth. At the next meeting, Ethan brought all the evidence he had collected, the videos, the emails, and the notes of Karen's actions. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for all the other residents who had been oppressed by her. This meeting wasn't just about resolving a personal conflict, but about bringing to light the abusive patterns that Karen had been using to manipulate and control the community. Karen, even though she was isolated within the community, still put on a front of arrogance and control. She wasn't going to give up without a fight. But this time, Ethan had the upper hand. Sarah's call, where she acknowledged the seriousness of Karen's actions, gave Ethan the platform he needed. And now, armed with undeniable evidence and the support of his neighbors, he was ready to end Karen's reign of terror. As the meeting went on, Karen's actions were exposed for all to see. She was no longer the figure of authority she once was, and her behavior started to unravel in front of the community. And even though she tried to deflect, Ethan remained calm, collected, and focused on exposing the truth. The room was filled with murmurs of disbelief as the reality of Karen's abuses came to light. As the meeting wrapped up, it was clear that things were about to change in the community. The power had shifted, and Karen was no longer in control. For the first time in a long time, the community felt a sense of hope and unity. The fight wasn't just Ethan's anymore. It was everyone's fight for justice. Ethan and Karen's story is not just a personal confrontation, but also a lesson in resilience in justice and life. In today's society, those in positions of power or authority often challenge us, imposing unfair rules or decisions. However, the key is to stand firm, protect our rights, and not let anyone abuse their power to manipulate or oppress others. Ethan chose not to give up. Instead of trying to avoid trouble, he courageously faced the challenge by seeking the truth, documenting evidence, and fighting to protect fairness not only for himself but also for others in the community. His story is not just a personal victory, but a triumph of truth and patience. When we stand up for what's right, we don't just change our own lives, but we create a ripple effect that influences those around us. The powerful message here is don't let the abuse of power or oppression defeat you. Keep fighting for justice, protect your rights, and always believe that the truth will find its way to shine. If you found Ethan's story truly inspiring and want to spread these valuable lessons, don't forget to hit like and show your support. If you've ever experienced something similar or just want to share your thoughts, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear from you. And if you want to hear more powerful stories like this one, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video. Share this video with your friends and family, because everyone deserves to hear about these battles for justice, rights, and the truth. Let's build a strong community where everyone can stand up and protect their rights, fearlessly and without oppression. Thank you for joining us in this journey. Share your positive energy and strength with those around you. Together, we can make a difference.